The investigation is now pretty well over. The recommendations for fresh legislation are in. Lawsuits have been filed. But still there is thought to be given and work to be done in developing a code for dealing with subversion in a free society. John Ehrlichman has been convicted for ordering the burglary of the office of the psychiatrist who treated Daniel Ellsberg, and the courts flatly rejected his argument that there was an inherent right vested in the executive to secure the nation's interest by illegal action. That decision has, for the most part, been accepted without much argument, but not by Mr. Mark Felt, a lifelong official of the FBI who rose to occupy the number 2 position under J. Edgar Hoover and Pat Gray. He stepped forward and announced that he had personally ordered 2 burglaries without court approval and that he would do it again. He is being questioned by a grand jury. Mr. Felt is a graduate of the University of Idaho and of the George Washington University Law School. He retired from the FBI in 1963 and is at work now on a book to be published next spring called The Pyramid. Mr. Roy Cohn began his legal career dealing with subversion. He was assistant prosecutor of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who was sent to the electric chair for an act of subversion. He subsequently became the chief counsel for Senator Joseph McCarthy and is the most prominent survivor of that age and apologist for its impulses. Mr. Cohn is a practicing attorney here in New York City. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Felt, what were the 2 burglaries he authorized?
Don't call them burglaries. The dictionary defines a burglary as a break-in with the intent to steal something. And what I authorized were 2 surreptitious entries to try and get information, and I think there's a distinction under the law. I mean, one's a violation of a local law, the other could be a violation of the civil rights laws. So I want to be sure that distinction is clear.
Is that one, by the way, that is accepted in the profession? A burglary must be with...
Oh, these are not burglaries. The term is just completely misused here. Nothing was stolen, nothing was taken.
Well, nothing was stolen from Dr. Lewis's office, but that was a burglary, wasn't it?
No, I don't think that was a burglary. I think the correct term here would probably be surreptitious entry, and not burglary. Burglary...
Does it carry the same sanction under the law?
No, it doesn't carry the same sanction under the law. I think what is stolen has an effect or the intent. The key thing here is the intent, and that's really what we're talking about in these cases. You cannot convict someone for a crime unless you establish an intent to violate a law. And I think a basic question, which we have here now, is when FBI agents serving their country...
He's already defending you, Mr. Felt.
For example...
He hasn't been indicted yet, but...
Right, and I've been on both sides. I work with the government and I practice law and defend people where the FBI is on the other side, so I've seen it from both vantage points. Now the question is, what was the intent and what was the motive of the FBI agents?
Well, let's ask Mr. Felt then to complete his thought here.
The 2 organizations?
Yeah.
One was El Fatah, which is the Palestine Liberation Organization, and I don't think I need to describe that any further. We all know of their terroristic acts all over the world, as a matter of fact. They wanted acts of terrorism in the United States, and I think that surreptitious entry blocked them. I think that's what did it, and I think by authorizing it, I saved a lot of lives.
What information did you get?
Membership list, and some other very confidential information which I can't disclose here now, which I think will be quite earth-shaking when it comes out. The other surreptitious entry which I authorized involved attempts to find the Weathermen underground fugitives. The Weathermen fugitives are an admitted communist organization. They have admitted ties with Cuba. They have claimed credit for many, many bombings in the United States, including the bombings of the Capitol building, the Pentagon, and the HEW, the State Department. They're a group of mad bombers, and they're sponsored and helped out of Cuba.
Okay, now the question arises, assuming that everybody who listened to you agreed that these are highly obnoxious and even dangerous organizations, the division is over those who believe that you have the authority to initiate a surreptitious entry. and those who believe that that authority vests elsewhere. Let me ask you, first of all, a factual question. Where does it, in fact, vest?
This is a gray area, and it began back during World War II when President Roosevelt called Mr. Hoover in and told him that the FBI should be responsible for internal subversion and domestic security, and that the FBI should coordinate intelligence information. There was no legislative fiat, and ever since that time the FBI has operated on the basis of that authority, where there's a national security aspect involved. This was not a common practice, but certainly an accepted technique. And one of the things that annoys me is the fact that everybody knows that the FBI used surreptitious entries against the mafia, and yet nobody complains about this. In other words, it's all right to violate their civil rights. It's all right to violate the civil rights of the Ku Klux Klan. But when the motivation is political, there are those that say that if you have a political manifesto, then it's all right to commit violence. And this is what the Weathermen say. It's just not American.
Well, the KKK is certainly political.
Yes, the KKK
It's not like
is political.
the mafia.
But all I'm saying is that nobody objects to FBI disruptive tactics against the Klan.
Well, I think that, let's ask Mr. Cohn what his feeling is on this. My understanding is that most people do believe that we ought to be governed by laws. Now the question is, do we have the right laws? Yesterday I saw Kojak. So Kojak goes rushing off somewhere and he shouts out the window of his car, "Get a warrant for room 417 of the El Dorado Hotel," as though it were as easy as getting a postage stamp by sticking in a quarter. Now why didn't you get a warrant to enter these various places? Is it because the Fourth Amendment requires you to be too specific in stating what you're looking for?
Well, there are two reasons. One, when foreign involvement was involved in these cases, the Bureau had never customarily got a warrant. And the reason that warrants are not completely satisfactory in security cases is because our legal system is a little cumbersome. It takes time. And to give you a good example, wiretaps are authorized under the Organized Crime Act against...
well, time means what, a day, a week, a month?
Well, in the organized crime case, it takes about 5 or 6 days to get the warrant to get the court order and get the warrant for the
did you have 5 or 6
entry.
days in dealing with El Fatah?
No, it was a matter of, just a matter of an hour or so.
Now, Mr. Cohn, in your experience, is the law resilient to the point of permitting you to waive the matter of a warrant in the case of an emergency? In Judge Drizel's opinion in the Ehrlichman case, he specifically cited the fact that over a month had been given to planning the Fielding break-in, so that in fact it would have been possible to get a warrant if one had been obtainable.
To answer that, there are provisions in the law to provide for emergency situations when it's just not possible. And this gets you to this point. Some discretion has to be vested in law enforcement officials such as the FBI. And what we're having now is a bloodbath directed against the FBI for the exercise of that discretion. And the question then becomes, when you get into these gray areas, was that discretion exercised, as I believe it was, in the best interests of the United States, according to law, as to their best understanding of law, and should we now, with a bunch of technicalities, pick it apart and make the FBI the criminals instead of making the criminals and the hijackers and the weathermen and those who have bombed police departments, killed people? This Croatian thing that happened a couple of days ago, the FBI, that happened a while back, the FBI was able to help so perfectly there because of the methods it uses and because of its intelligence gathering techniques. Now, by applying the strict technical standards we have here under the guise of civil liberties, we are completely destroying the ability of the FBI to function with any kind of on-the-moment discretion, which discretion, I believe, has been exercised in 99% of the cases in the very best interests of the people of the United States trying to protect freedoms in this country.
Okay, well, what's the 1%?
The 1%.
Let's focus the 1% in which, when has the FBI done something that you have disapprove of?
when they helped the government try to prosecute me, and probably in a few other cases.
But did that involve surreptitious? Was it they who broke into your mail?
No, but my mail was broken into by another government agency.
Well, now, you objected to that as a violation of your rights.
I objected to that as a violation of my rights.
Well, but the rights, what about the rights of other people, like, say, members of the Socialist Workers' Party?
I suppose when you talk about mail cover and things like that, there is a difference between a case like mine, which was something not involving national security or anything like that, and a question when you're trying to locate dangerous criminals who publicly advertise the fact that their job is to bomb buildings, destroy police departments, kill and murder people. I think under instances like that, going back to the Roosevelt executive order, going back to the Keefe decision in the United States Supreme Court, that a certain amount of discretion has to be vested in an agency which has been, until it's recently been smeared, probably the most highly regarded from a standpoint of integrity and proper exercise of judgment of any in the world. You're raising a big question here, Mr. Buckley, as to one thing. You cannot eliminate the human equation no matter how many laws you pass, no matter how tightly you limit the instances when you have to apply for warrants, wiretaps, and anything like that. There is still going to be a couple of those people on top who have to make decisions. And the question we're really dealing with now is, under certain controls, are not the best interests of this country served when these decisions have been made in the past by people like Mr. Hoover, who have performed, in my opinion, so decently and effectively in the protection of freedoms and liberties in this country.
This is William F. Buckley, Jr. talking to Mr. Mark Felt, Mr. Roy Cohn on the subject of subversion and the law. Well, let me try to pin you down, if I may. You say that occasionally the FBI errs, but you seem to be saying that occasionally it errs because everybody makes a mistake. But is it to make simply a mistake impulsively, to have entered some 600-700 times illegally the offices of the Socialist Workers' Party over a period of 30 years? Now, you say you're dealing with dangerous criminals. Well, if they are dangerous criminals, why was there never an arrest in the course of 30 years? Do you have an answer to that, Mr. Felt?
Well, that's a pretty good question, but I think you have to differentiate between intelligence gathering and criminal investigations. The main problem in connection with the Socialist Workers' Party, and I'd like to distinguish that this is not the Socialist Party we're talking about, this is the Socialist Workers' Party, which was founded by Leon Trotsky when he got kicked out of the Communist Party in 1917 or 1918. He founded his own international party, the Socialist Workers' Party. They were even more violent, I would say, than the Stalin group. And it seems to me that the FBI has the responsibility to find out what people of this ilk are doing and what their plans are.
It seems to you, but does it seem to Congress?
I think that when Congress finally acts on the matter, that it will seem so to them also.
Who's Congress? Is the Church Committee Congress? I mean, that's the question.
Well, we are saddled with the people we elect.
Yes, well, unfortunately we are in many instances. But you take this committee that just did this hatchet job on the FBI and intelligence gathering. So the chairman of the committee is running for president at the moment and leaks out 14 separate stories from the one report in order to get headlines a couple of days before he runs in a primary. I just don't happen to be one of those who believes the FBI should be sacrificed on an altar of politics. And I think that's what's happening today.
I think I agree, but I do think that a serious point is raised. After all, you entered a front-page New York Times complaint, and quite properly so, when somebody tapped your mail. Now, suppose that Mr. Felt had said, well, we tapped Mr. Cohn's mail for the very simple reason that we were after information on the basis of which we might have established that he was a lawbreaker.
Insufficient, Mr. Buckley.
I think it's insufficient, too. But now,
the
Socialist Workers' Party say it's quite true that we were founded by Leon Trotsky. But if in the course of 30 years you couldn't find us double parking, isn't it time to suggest that the emergency on the basis of which the FBI, acting on its own impulse, breaks into our offices and rummages around is something that ought to be leavened through legal process?
Okay, the question there, though, is the difference between a prosecution and the intelligence gathering function. For example, we've had all this fuss about, at the time of President Kennedy's assassination, was the Bureau in position to furnish names of people in the area so it might have been prevented. They obviously would not have enough in advance to prosecute the man who was going to attempt to assassinate the president, but they might have had enough to warn local officials against it. In the case of this Croatian hijacking, the New York-Chicago plane, based upon the information they have, I understand a tremendous amount of time was saved in the location and the circumstances of the actual hijacking and hijackers. So there are instances where when they can gather information, take break-ins in the weathermen situations, here are people, bomb police headquarters, Pentagon, so on. If the FBI can get those membership lists and be in a protective situation, falling short of actually prosecuting them before the bombings take place, but being in position to prevent them, being in position to alert local people. This is an important self-protective thing for the people of the United States and does not involve some crazy agents going out there with some kind of intent to break a law. Not at all.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Felt, in order to get the kind of information that allowed you to have some information about Oswald, was something illegal, quotes, unquotes, done? That is to say, if you had not
You mean, was there a surreptitious entry against Oswald?
Well, I know that there was not, but the fact is that he was a name in your docket, so that when he was actually pulled up, you were able to get his profile pretty fast. Now, did he exist in your files as a result of the FBI's doing something which is now considered, quotes, illegal?
No, not to my knowledge.
Not Oswald.
So therefore, you have therefore there would be no interruption in the FBI's intelligence services.
No, that's not correct. And let me make a very important point that I think has been left up in the air here, and that's the fact that we're talking sort of as if this thing was a very common occurrence, whereas the exact contrary is true. Now, I mean, you mentioned a large number of entries into the Socialist Workers' Party. This occurred over a very long period of
30
time.
years.
And actually, these techniques are very, very closely controlled. They're not used indiscriminately.
Well, Pat Gray said he didn't know about them. They're not all that closely controlled, are they?
It's not the only thing he didn't know about.
But another thing that's very important, that there's not a single agent who was involved in one of these cases who was not vote motivated in any way but by loyalty to the United States and his desire to protect the best interests of the United States.
Well, but that's kind of a dangerous standard, isn't it? Because
it's something to remember, though.
Sure, but the guy who tapped Roy Cohn's mail might have said that he was motivated by a loyalty to the United States. Unfortunately, that's what any Ku Klux Klan man would say.
They've already said it.
Up. Sure. So we want something other than subjective interpretation.
We all agree you can't
loyalty.
have subjective interpretations, but I think Mr. Felt has made the point. The number of instances in which this occurred and the circumstances have been enormously exaggerated. When you think of the number of instances, if you take the number of instances of entries with warrants and without in FBI cases, you'll probably get a 10,000 to 1 ratio. And I firmly believe, in the case of the Weathermen particularly, and the Palestine liberation surreptitious entry, in both of those cases, you're dealing in a day of violence, of hijackings, of destruction, of lives, of bombs. And if the FBI can't have a certain amount of latitude in internal security cases to get enough information together so it can at least be forewarned and try to do what it has done, a successful protective job along those lines, we're going to destroy our own freedoms under the guise of trying to save them.
Do the American people have a false image of how it works? I gave you the example of Kojak last night, who sort of says, get me a warrant and meet me at the corner. I take it doesn't work. It's not that easy.
You're almost saying
it's not that easy.
It's not that easy.
No.
Okay, now what do you have to do to give you the authority for a surreptitious entry? What do you actually have to say to whom?
Well, in the cases in which I was involved, a subordinate submitted a memorandum to me with complete justification. And in one case, I referred it to Gray with my recommendation that it be handled, and in the other case, I approved it myself because Gray was out of town.
No, I said, what do you have to do to be legal?
Suppose you would go in a courtroom.
I think that under the Keith case, which Mr. Cohn mentioned, that all you would have to do to be legal would be to establish a substantial foreign connection. And apparently the Supreme Court...
What if there is no foreign connection?
If there is no foreign connection, then I think it would be held to be illegal.
Here's what you have to do to answer you mechanically. what you have to do is this: the FBI agent in charge of the investigation dictates, say, a one-page affidavit giving just a brief sketch of what
the probable cause.
Probable cause, exactly. This is taken over by the prosecutor to a federal judge in camera.
Now, is that usually, does that remain intact, or does it leak usually? There?
Well,
is that dangerous?
I'm sure the FBI would spend a lot of sleepless nights if they thought there were a possibility of leaks. I don't want to be critical on some of the new members of our judiciary. I don't know what the leak situation. I'm sure no one would deliberately leak it, but you almost have a judicial state of mind on the part of some judges today where anything the FBI or a law enforcement agency asks for is prima facie suspect. In other words, the criminals seem to be the ones who always have the rights today, and the general public seem to be the ones who are losing the rights.
Are you saying there is a historical record of it? Can you imagine a situation in which the director of the FBI would come across information of vital national security interest, which he felt he had to get hold of, but felt that it would be a risk to the national security to involve in the process a federal judge, or could he go to a federal judge that he knows is completely reliable?
Well, that, I suppose, gets to a dangerous judge selecting thing, but I think the answer is a certain amount of discretion should be vested into the director of the FBI to trust absolutely no one not working directly on the matter. And the thing.
How would you put that into law?
I would enact a law. I would enact a law. I mean, all you have to do is take some of the sections out of the John Mitchell Organized Crime Act or something like, under which he practically got convicted himself. But if you give the FBI the authority in national security cases to have surreptitious entries with the approval of the Attorney General, with the approval of the Director of the FBI on certain showings, to me, as an American, that is sufficiently protective. Looking at a 50-year record, the FBI has not abused this right or has not abused this privilege. And the instances...
Oh, come on.
I don't think it has.
You mean finding out about the sex life of Martin Luther King was not an abuse?
Well, I don't know if finding out about the sex life of Martin Luther King is an abuse, or how they happened to find out about it, or whether that was part of something else. But a very liberal Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, authorized the interception of Martin Luther King's wires.
It was certainly an abuse.
So, well,
Not necessarily.
I don't know if it
Let's
was an
talk
abuse
about
or what.
that.
I don't
All
know.
right, let's talk about that. This is William F. Buckley Jr. talking to Mr. Roy Cohn and Mr. Mark Felt on subversion and the law. Mr. Felt.
Well, you talk about the FBI investigating Dr. Martin Luther King's sex life. That's just not true at all. He was investigated because the FBI was aware of an attempt by the Communist Party to infiltrate his black movement. And the investigation was perfectly justified on that basis. All the wiretaps, all the microphones were authorized by the Attorney General. Now, it just so happens that the material was turned up on those tapes did not relate to communist affiliation. It related to other things, which were...
Well, but it was an abuse to pass that information along, wasn't it?
I think it was an abuse to pass it along, right.
Yeah.
Pass
But
it
it
along.
was...
Therefore, there has been an abuse.
Pass it along where?
Well, for instance, I know about it.
Well, you know about everything.
Okay,
You're,
well, that's
you're
an
the
abuse.
eyes and ears of the world.
That's an abuse,
for a
isn't
lot
it?
of people. All right.
I think several news people knew about it.
Sure. I mean, it was...
They knew about it 10 years ago, and if you knew about it 10 years ago, why didn't you raise the question then?
Yeah, and another thing, I think
I did.
Okay.
They probably knew about it from other sources. Now, you might raise this question. Why has this committee, just finished now, not released any portions of the 55-page report on Dr. Martin Luther King, which I understand would have shed a great deal of light on certain activities of his which might have fully justified Attorney General Robert Kennedy and the Bureau in doing what they did. That report has been locked up by the committee, but the committee, because of the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King, but the committee has not extended a similar courtesy to the memory of John Edgar Hoover and has permitted all sorts of rank hearsay, abusive attacks on him, leaks to the papers and everything else, and the result of it has been how they can get new FBI agents, how they can restore the morale. Look, these people take care of bank robberies, they take care of kidnappings, hijackings. They've done a fantastic job for this country. Why anyone would want to be an FBI agent today with a salary that's about equal to that of an elevator operator here in New York, with this kind of indiscriminate abuse being heaped on all of them because of a possible few mistakes?
Yeah.
I think what I realize, Mr. Buckley, you're pinning us very hard on subjective tests, on legal tests of obtaining warrants. But conceding arguendo, every point you're making, I still say we are not seeing the forest for the trees. And on the overall, there has been an excellent record on the part of the FBI.
Well, I agree with you, and that it's certainly correct that one can see the sort of a leering pleasure that many of the critics of the FBI are getting out of this. Nothing would disappoint them more than an investigation of the FBI that proved that the FBI was guiltless. Mr. Charles, I think George Terrell once said about the Jesuits that they tend to score off the exaggeration of their critics, accuse them of murdering 3 men and a dog, and they will triumphantly produce the dog alive. Now, are we here triumphantly producing the dog alive by saying the fact of the matter is that the FBI has done important service? There may be something here that we aren't facing, and let me ask you a straight legal question. You would like to see legislation written that would permit the director of the FBI or the Attorney General to authorize surreptitious entry. Question, is that in violation of the Fourth Amendment?
I don't believe it is in violation of the Fourth Amendment.
I don't believe it would be. I think they got the court order. If the law required a court order.
No, he
Mr.
said without a
Buckley's
court
stopping
order.
short
Oh,
of that.
I see.
He's saying with the written approval of the Attorney General.
Where the executive decides by itself, of its own motion, to proceed to surreptitious entry without any other branch of government.
Isn't that
acquiescence.
exactly what happened in the Ehrlichman case?
But that
yes,
was without a,
yes.
Mr. Buckley
and
saying
the court said it was
It's illegal. So
Mr.
I think
but
you'd
Mr.
have
Buckley
to,
is asking, can that be cured by legislation?
That's right.
I'm not
If Congress
sure.
passed such a law, would that be
Would it stand
violative of
up?
the Fourth
Would it-
Amendment? I'm
would it-
saying I think it would stand up. I think it would come within the power of Congress to pass such a law which would clearly confer constitutional authority.
How would you argue it? That is to say, suppose I was the judge in the Court of Appeals, say, and you appeared as a Solicitor General in defense of this law, and I would say to you, well, now, Mr. Cohn, will you explain why it's necessary to seek only the permission of the Director or the Attorney General rather than that of a federal judge? What would you answer?
My answer would be that in certain cases
Don't
involving...
forget to say Your Honor.
Your Honor, absolutely. Your Honor, in certain cases involving national security, internal security, Congress has stated, in view of past experience, and let me add this one thing. Do you ordinarily view a gambling game here in New York or something like that as a violation of a federal law? If somebody's having a numbers game out in the street or something, you wouldn't think so at all. You think that's something you laugh at, or you call the cops and they get fined $5.
De minimis non curat lex.
Right. But now it's a federal crime because Congress said, the legislature, the United States Congress, having studied organized crime, decided that gambling is one of the features of organized crime. We will therefore create a conclusive presumption that any gambling activity involving more than $2,000 and 5 people is a federal interstate commerce violation, whether it is in fact or it isn't. And that law has been upheld as constitutional.
Like the Lindbergh Law.
Right, by the Supreme Court of the United States. So I say Congress can make a finding saying, having reviewed the history of hijackings, bombings, terrorism, and violence, endangering innocent people in the United States, we now conclude as a legislative matter that it is necessary to vest in the Attorney General and the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation the authority in instances which they certify to be essential to the national security and the protection against these violent and terrorist activities, the right on written approval of the Director of the Attorney General, the right of surreptitious entry for the purpose of the informing and protective function involved. In my belief, having from both a prosecutorial and a defense standpoint read these cases, I think after the Keith case and some others that this law would withstand the test of constitutionality.
Well, if it did, even so, Mr. Felt would be out on a limb, right? Inasmuch as he did not have, in the case of El Fatah or the Weathermen, the formal written acquiescence.
This is an interesting point. The department is making no objection, no investigation of the El Fatah surreptitious entries on the grounds that it was involved
a foreigner.
But with regard to the Weathermen fugitives are U.S. citizens. However, my argument is that there is substantial foreign involvement. Their paper is prepared down in Cuba. They defend Cuba. They've had traffic back and forth with Cuba. I think there's substantial foreign involvement.
No, I know what you think. I don't doubt your motives at all.
No, but I think legally.
I'm simply asking I'm trying to universalize from your experience. That's why I'm asking Mr. Cohn to say whether under his legislation, which he thinks would pass the courts, you would have been covered. So far as I can see, you wouldn't have been, because you didn't have the written authorization of the Attorney General, or even of the Director.
We really did. The word written, I mean, I'm sure that there's no magic to that word. If there might be an emergency situation, suppose Mr. Felt were in Chicago or something, and Mr. Hoover or Mr. Kelly were in Washington, I think sometimes you have to move quickly. You know, for example, Israel moved rather quickly in moving into Uganda. I don't think they even got a search warrant or a warrant to leave, or warrant to land, or proper permission from General Amin's CAB to land at the airport. But when the emergency came up, they went in there and they stopped the hijacking and they rescued the people who had been hijacked, and they came back home. And there does come
Roy. That's really a very bad example, because that was done under the powers of the Commander-in-Chief, which are exercised by the Prime Minister.
Well, maybe this legislation here would...
Nobody denies the President of the United States acting as Commander-in-Chief.
Right,
would have the right to conduct a military operation.
Okay, but Mr. Felt's telling you that President Roosevelt did, in fact, as Commander-in-Chief and as Chief Executive, give Mr. Hoover...
I know, but what Roosevelt did is now clearly considered illegal.
Not necessarily.
And so did the Giselle opinion.
Well, that's not a Supreme Court decision.
No, it's not. But I don't know that anybody. Well, as a matter of fact, I do know that Ehrlichman's appeal of the Giselle decision was denied
in the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia. But we're still. I don't know if the Supreme Court denied cert or didn't deny cert. But I have a feeling that if the Supreme Court reviewed
he was told to go to jail about last week.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you how I feel about that.
Okay, but as I understand it, one of the reasons we're talking about this is that everybody acknowledges that certain things that were done by Roosevelt, by Kennedy, by Johnson, and by Nixon are now understood, and Truman, are now understood to have been illegal.
Let me throw this comment out. Had somebody come to me and requested authorization to break in Dr. Fielding's office, I would have told him no, no way.
Well, you have said no in the past. Didn't John Dean ask you for something?
Yes, I've said no to them many times.
Well, John Dean asked you to doctor a report,
yes,
as I remember,
yes,
which you declined to do,
right,
for political purposes.
Right.
Now, but I think the question before the House is, ought you, however high a position you achieve within the FBI, have the authority to say yes, or must it be an authority that comes in from other sources? Mr. Cohn has said, yes, he agrees it should be an authority. It should be an authority that involves the Director and the Attorney General, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an authority granted by the court.
I would be inclined to go along with that, because you can get the Attorney General approval in a relatively short time if you think it's justified. If you have to go into court, you're talking about more time. And you're also talking about the fact that maybe highly sensitive information is spread just one more chain further.
This is William F. Buckley, Jr., talking to Mr. Mark Felt, Mr. Roy Cohn on subversion and the law. One of the cases that caused a great deal of attention at the time that the Church Committee was conducting its hearings was one in which one of your agents infiltrated the KKK, and in order to convince the other members of the KKK that he was one of them, participated in actually beating up a civil rights worker. Now, is this a length to which you think FBI agents ought to be prepared to go in order to establish their cover, i.e. to participate in illegality?
In the first place, that was not an agent, that was an informer. In the second place, I think that he should restrain himself. He certainly can't go in there to a KKK meeting and wear a tuxedo. He's not going to get by with that. Similarly, if you're trying to penetrate the New Left, you can't go in there and refuse to smoke a joint. You'd have to do that. But no, I don't think he should have participated in physical beatings, and I don't think any FBI agent told him to.
These things, what, have to be played by ear?
Well, when you're dealing with an informer, remember that you're dealing with someone who is closely involved with the group in which you're interested. Let's take the Mafia, it's clear. When you get an informer in the Mafia, he's not going to be a Rhodes Scholar graduate. He's going to be someone with enough credibility with these people to be able to establish himself and help get information for you. And when you're dealing with this type of people, you're dealing with people who may not always be completely stable. You're dealing with people who may be unreliable. And when you find they're unreliable, you have to eliminate them as an informer.
Mr. Cohn, let me ask you this. Mr. Felt seems to be saying that there is a political motivation, and I think that you have inflected the same thing in these attacks on the FBI. Why would you say that the American liberal community would have any interest in protecting the weathermen?
I don't know that they have an interest in protecting the weathermen, but exposure of the weathermen or the preventing of the damage the weathermen have been doing is a drop in the bucket to certain members of the American liberal community compared to an opportunity to take a shot at the FBI. This has always been one of their big hang-ups because it's been the FBI which has been so effective in exposing the revolutionary movements and the New Left movements in this country. And you know, there's such a contradiction in thinking about it. You talk about informants and privileges. Here we've had 4 newspaper men in Oakland going to jail rather than reveal informants. We have Mr. Daniel Shore claiming amendments down before Congress rather than reveal an informant. But it's getting to the point now, as a result of this last investigation, that judge after judge is making the FBI either reveal the name of informants or enough information so that the defendants can identify the name, to the point that we understand in law enforcement and defense circles that informants are beginning to dry up. What I'm saying to you is there has been an overkill here. And whereas the American liberal community, of course, doesn't just want to defend the weathermen, the American liberal community wants to get the FBI so badly that they are willing to pay the price. And I just think the price is much too high to pay.
They don't even understand how big a price they're paying.
Well, they're paying the price of American freedom. You see, the funny part about the FBI, we've heard about the Miranda case, which gives these rights of warnings to defendants, one of the most important things to help defendants in criminal cases in many a year. The FBI gave Miranda warnings long before the court said it had to be done. The FBI investigated and prosecuted civil rights cases long before others got on the bandwagon. J. Edgar Hoover was one of those who broke up the Plumbers Plan when it was introduced at the Nixon White House. The politics, you're absolutely right, Mr. Buckley. I think that both Mr. Felt and I are saying politics is behind this. And politics is very substantially behind this. They've taken the number of instances here, magnified them into an overall broad brush attack on what has been and is a great agency, and not enough is being done to knock down that attack, and the losers are going to be the people of this country.
Mr. Ellie Brand is from Yale University. Mr. Brand.
I should like to ask Mr. Cohn to focus in a bit on the FBI's discretionary or subjective element, which he seems to have so much confidence in. I would agree that the weathermen are in fact a drop in the bucket because it seems that they've actually influenced the lives of very few Americans. Whereas when we look at the trauma of Watergate, which leaves us with an oversensitized media preoccupied with curtain valences, and which leaves us with the possibility of an unelected president passing out of office, I would suggest that this has been a very severe threat to the peace of mind of the American people and the general welfare. My question is, doesn't that then make the FBI itself a subversive organization?
No, I don't think it makes the FBI a subversive organization at all, in any sense of the word. Your beginning premise that the weathermen, for example, haven't done as much damage as has the Watergate period or the Watergate era, I don't agree with you at all on that. weathermen, just very quickly, weathermen by their own statements have blown up police headquarters in Berkeley, California, Golden State, California, Pentagon, HEW, National Guard installations. People have been killed as a result of explosions in factories where the weathermen make bombs. I think that threat is probably as great to the people of America as some politician walking into a Watergate headquarters or something along those lines. So I don't agree with your qualitative analysis. As far as the FBI being a subversive organization, not at all. I don't think there was ever any such intent. I don't think that has been the fact. What happened in Watergate was done for plain political motives. What was done here, what has been done by the FBI, which I say turned out 99% correct, 99% right, was done with the best of intent and with a wonderful track record, which certainly excuses a record of 100% perfection.
Ms. Deborah RHODE is from the law school at Yale. Ms. RHODE?
I would like to ask Mr. Felt if, to suppose that he had not been convinced that there was a substantial foreign involvement in the Weatherman structure at the time in which that surreptitious entry had been authorized, but still perceived the Weatherman structure to, composed as it was of the mad bombers to whom you earlier alluded, presented a significant threat to American national security interests, would then you have authorized that warrant?
That's a very, very good question, and I don't know what I would have done. I think that we've got two factors here. We've got a factor of total safety on one hand for the individual, and on the other we have a factor of total privacy. And we cannot have both. The only way we can give a man total privacy would be to put him in the middle of the Sahara Desert. I would have thought about it very carefully. I would have thought about it very carefully. Now, I'm not saying yes or no, but I certainly would have considered it.
Well, if I might pursue that for a moment, if a local police chief had arrogated to himself the authority to authorize a surreptitious entry in those circumstances, would you be comfortable with the power vesting in that officer? And if not, what distinguished your position officially from his?
Because it's the FBI that has the responsibility for protecting the internal security of the country, and I feel that the FBI is probably in a little better position to evaluate, partly in a little better position to use discretion. And I feel that when legislation is passed, that it should be restricted to the FBI.
Is there anything in the way the scope of your office is defined, or the way the courts have interpreted the Fourth Amendment, which makes a distinction between the FBI's power to authorize warrantless searches and police departments in circumstances that they perceive present a threat to domestic security?
Well, I think you've got two completely different situations there. I don't think they're comparable.
Have the courts preempted for the federal government all concerned with national security? They have, haven't they?
Yes.
Well, what about the analog? There must be in New York City police whose concerns are for security of the city, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I would give a narrower answer than broader answer than Mr. Felt did to the young lady's question. I would say there might be certain instances where if the police commissioner of New York immediately obtained information to the effect that there was about reliable, and he regarded in his training as reliable information, that there was to be a bombing, which is like an everyday occurrence around here, that there was about to be a bombing or something like that, and that there was a place where the names of those who might be involved in the organization and such address and all of that, I'm not going to vote to fire the police commissioner if he sends a couple of people down there to try to get that list and try to move into position where he can stop that bombing before it happens. I think it goes beyond the FBI, and I think that all people dedicated and in charge of law enforcement have to have that human equation of some discretion in dealing with on-the-moment, split-second life and death situations.
This is William F. Buckley, Jr. speaking with Mr. Roy Cohn, Mr. Mark Felt on subversion and the law. Mr. Jonathan KAUFMAN is also from Yale.
Yes, Mr. Cohn, this proposal of yours that the director of the FBI be allowed to have surreptitious entries with a written approval from the Attorney General sounds like something from a bad Alan Drury novel. I mean, if
I didn't know he had written a bad novel.
if Watergate has shown us anything, it's that while you admit it was all motivated by politics, the cover for it all was national security. What is to stop a president?
That was the ostensible cover.
Well, I'm saying, but under your law, an Attorney General could say, yes, it's national security that we break into, let's say, the Socialist Party or the Democratic Party.
Right, I understand that. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it will happen. And then you're going to
But
get...
it did happen.
No, it didn't happen. You're going to get to the ultimate test of a court finally having to be the arbiter of it if there's an arrest, the prosecution, and all of that. See, this is an area in which we can never come to a bottom line decision because you can never deprive people from some degree of the necessity of judgment making. And because in the case of Watergate it was abused, I'm not prepared to wipe out 50 years of trained, non-political FBI law service to the people of this country under some kind of a theory that because non-FBI people in Watergate did such and such. Remember, it was Mr. Hoover who walked in and broke up the plumber's plan. And I think if Mr. Hoover had been around, a lot of different things would have happened. And I think the trouble the president got into to start with is when he put in Gray, who was not an FBI man, as director of the FBI rather than a trained FBI man such as Mr. Felt or a number of others.
Here you disagree with Mr. Felt, who believes that Mr. Hoover should have been retired earlier.
I don't. I wish Mr. Hoover was still here.
Well, what I said was that I thought he should have retired while he was still champ, and I feel terribly bad about what's being done to him. He's being pilloried.
Well, I think he's a champ to me, and I think he's a champ to millions of people around this country who go back to kidnapping days, go up to the days when he had the guts to develop information during World War II, and the Soviet Union was our ally, which was without which we would have been absolutely dead in our information gathering and our attempts to expose the threats to American freedom when it turned out that the communists were after us too, just as Hitler had been. I remember what he has done for the protection of civil rights and liberties, and I think to the American people, Mr. J. Edgar Hoover is still a pretty darn good name.
Go ahead, Ms. Kaufman.
I think it's great that J. Edgar Hoover caught Al Capone too, but for the past 10 years...
He didn't catch Al Capone. I think that was the
IRS,
income tax
wasn't it?
people, yeah.
But I mean, the image of the FBI is fine, but for the past 10 years, they've been systematically engaged in opening mail, in illegal surveillance.
That's not correct. That's not correct. And that's one of the things that makes me so mad, because you believe everything you read in the press, and I'm telling you here now that a lot of what you read is not true. Much of what you read is distorted. Much of what you read, like the Martin Luther King situation, was knowledge to the press 10 years ago. So let's wait till this thing is adjudicated, and let's wait till we see what's an abuse and what isn't an abuse. Let's be sure that facts are facts.
How do you know they read it in the press rather than having heard it at Yale Law School?
Well, they probably haven't had anybody from the department up there lately.
No, what Mr. Felt says is very true. You're getting one side. You didn't live through a lot of these things. You've lived through the last number of years of them. But the very bad part, as you go around to colleges, universities around the country, there's only one side now. The FBI is getting pilloried, and there just isn't a word to straighten out the facts or try to give the American public the reminders and the other side of the facts. It's a double standard, and it's a situation which smacks very much of McCarthyism.
The Church Intelligence Committee has errors in it. It has bias. As a matter of fact, I was talking to one of the investigators, and I complained that their first day presentation was very biased and slanted. And he didn't deny that, but he made this comment. He said that, well, we expected the FBI to come back in and give answers to all these things and defend all these things. The Church Committee report has errors in it. A lot of errors.
Mr. Brand.
Well, perhaps I should address my question this time to Mr. Felt. As affiliated with the FBI, was there some coda, some body of laws or some general guide by which an FBI agent on the field could refer in making this snap of the moment, as Mr. Cohn would have us believe, decision, in which he has the alternative of breaking the law in order to protect the public interest or following what he believes to be?
The answer to your question is yes, the Manual of Rules and Regulations and the Manual of Instructions. They're loose-leaf bound books that are 12, letter size, about that high. Very detailed instructions as to what they can do and what they can't.
These are carefully trained people with probably the greatest record for integrity and capability of performance of any law enforcement agency in the history of the world. You're not sending a bunch of idiots around there to
No, that's
make
true,
these decisions.
but it's also true, I think, to judge from Mr. Felt's writings, that it was pretty well agreed that whatever Mr. Hoover said was it.
Well, he was the boss.
He was the boss.
He was the boss, but he exercised as boss a certain authority which we don't really approve of.
You
do
mean
we?
he was too strong while
For
President
instance,
Ford was too
well,
weak, or something like that?
if Ehrlichman had been able to persuade the court that Nixon told him to break into Fielding's office, it would not have been an excuse. Now, certainly, Mr. Nixon was Ehrlichman's boss in the same sense that Hoover
Sure.
was Mr. Felt's boss, but Mr. Felt would not have done certain things, or ought not to have done certain things, even assuming that Mr. Hoover had asked you to do so.
Name one.
I say you would not have if he had asked you to.
If he had asked me to do something that I felt was morally wrong,
Okay.
I would have resigned.
Suppose he had said to you, Mark, go
He called
over.
me Felt.
Okay, suppose he had said to you, Felt, go over and tell LBJ about the fun that Martin Luther King had at the motel last night.
If he had told me to do just that, I would have argued with him, but I think that had I not won the argument, I would have done it. It seems to me that the President of the United States has a right to know of the...
Come on.
Yes, I think I would have.
Well, it's an issue
Well,
that never
I really
arose.
I think this is really shocking, the notion that the President of the United States has a right to know about the sex life of anybody.
Well,
but-
apparently Mr. Woodward and Mr. Bernstein think we should all know about the sex life of the President of the United
Now, wait
States.
a minute.
so-
Now, wait a minute. They were acting as gossip columnists. They were not acting as people who authorized surreptitious entry. I'm sorry you made that point because I think it weakens your case.
well,
The,
you
the right of Woodward and Bernstein or Truman Capote publicly to engage in thoughts about the sexual antics of anybody is a First Amendment problem.
Yeah,
But
well,
it's
we
very
get-
different from,
right.
from telling somebody to break in, record, transcribe, and then circulate.
Well, I
that.
think if the premise of your question is, Mr. Felt's already answered, said nobody went in to find out about Martin Luther King's sex life, we're getting way off the point.
No.
That wasn't done, that wasn't the intent.
That
You're
wasn't
asking
what I
him-
asked him. I asked him.
Yeah.
He asked me. He said,
All right.
"Name one." So I gave him a hypothetical situation,
All right.
and he ended up by saying that he thought the president had a right to
Well,
know
did
about
anything
this.
like that ever happen? Did Mr. Hoover
No,
say?
no.
I mean, we're just way off in the clouds on that. I don't
Well,
think...
no, we've discovered something. We've discovered something in direct answer to Mr. Brand's inquiry. And what we've discovered is that Mr. Felt believes that the President of the United States has rights, which I certainly don't think he has. I don't know who voted the President of the United States the right to act as peeping Tom.
But you're not defining this properly. The President of the United States had a very great interest. In fact, he called Martin Luther King in, and they had a long talk in the Rose Garden. And the President told him to discontinue his associations with suspected Communist Party members. King didn't pay any attention to that, and the President was very interested in it. And I think that the President had a right to know any phase of the investigation. Now, the mic was put in because there was an expected meeting between a member of the Communist Party and Martin Luther King. It didn't turn out that way. The meeting was substantially different from that. But I think that you're saying that it was just solely for sex purposes. It was for...
No, I'm not.
Well,
I'm not saying what it was that was the motive of placing the mic there. I'm saying that the mic was placed there. It picked up extrinsic information of no national concern, which is now part of the national
All right.
patrimony.
Now we can agree on something
Yeah.
that's, let's say, anti the way certain. I think your point is very well taken. Mr. Buckley is really suggesting this to us. Shouldn't such legislation or discretion or something include a method of striking from Bureau and other intelligence agency files irrelevant personal information?
Right. What I call a
comes in-
bonded bugger.
Right. I think by all means it should. I'm a strong believer in rights of privacy, and when something is not relevant to national security or the purpose of the investigation, it should be eliminated. It's nobody's darn business and should go out. We're not talking about that here at all. We're talking about the intelligence function of the Bureau, and I certainly believe things which would eliminate things about people's private lives and all that, a method should be found which is not too difficult to have that stricken and excluded from files, and I don't think either Mr. Felt or I or anyone connected with the Bureau would argue about the maintenance of such things in files. That's not the object of the investigation.
Ms. RHODE?
We spoke earlier of possible legislative amendments to surveillance procedures. Wouldn't an alternative, perhaps to Mr. Cohn's proposal of having Attorney General authorization of searches, be to have simply an expedited procedure for obtaining warrants, even in situations where you only have 1 or 2 hours, but at least a situation which protects the judicial prerogative to superintend
I think I
agency
understand what
decisions?
you're asking, Deborah, and I think that could be written into the law, but it would have to be an emergency authorization, subject to review by the court, with full justification as to why it was handled on an emergency basis.
Sort of a undated signature
Yeah,
on
no,
it.
but I think there are two questions here. Deborah's point is, I think they can both be worked in. If there is time, you can have an expedited warrant procedure, which might cover, say, 30% of the cases where they did not go in with warrants, so on, because of the delays that would have been incurred. That might eliminate it. Have an expedited situation. A second part, though, that Mr. Felt and I probably would hold out for, there can be that hotline, split-second phone call, which requires the director of the FBI or the head of the police department to send somebody in there 1, 2, 3. And Mr. Felt is now talking to the point that should be carefully documented and recorded to prevent any type of abuse. But I think these things are all doable. I think what's not doable is the attempt to destroy the FBI and the whole system by the excess, I believe, of criticism that has come about in the last few months.
The leaders in the Kremlin must be chuckling to themselves at this flagellation that's going on over here, because if they planned it, they couldn't have harmed the FBI or the CIA any more than we've done ourselves.
You know, we've done in a year what they haven't been able to do in 30 or 40 years.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mark Felt. Thank you, Mr. Roy Cohn. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you all.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. That's Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded in part by public television stations.